And joining us now is Stephen Yates, foreign policy expert and CEO of DC International Advisory. We might also add former National Security Deputy Advisor to Vice President Dick Cheney. Stephen, it's good to have you with us. Now, the Ukrainian interim Interior Minister is saying that the developments in Crimea amount to a military invasion and occupation. Granted, this could be what some might call the fog of war, but based on the information that we're getting, do you believe that to be the case?
Well, it's wonderful to join you, J.D. Yes, I do believe that would be a reasonable interpretation of what's happening. The United States is doing an awful lot of monitoring while the Russians have been doing a lot of influencing, and it appears they're doing a little bit of invading as well.
Now, we do know that the ousted president, the aforementioned Viktor Yanukovych, held a press conference today in Russia speaking Russian. Now, granted, there are ethnic Russians within the Ukraine, but what is the significance of his choice of language during the press conference?
Well, it's one of the legacies of history where we have these different parts of the Russian near abroad that were a part of the Soviet Union, where you had in some ways induced or forced migration to try to control populations that were a majority of a different ethnicity. And Ukraine has a legacy population of a lot of ethnic Russians, and the country is divided that way. And so basically what this is a statement of cultural and civil war, in my sense, where you have a leader who used deadly force against his people, and then, yes, reasonably he did face probably threats to his life and has retreated to his ethnic enclave.
So, as you say, civil war, that requires amplification, and joining me here alongside is Newsmax magazine senior editor Dave Patton to follow up with a couple of questions.
So, Mr. Yates, in 2008 we saw Russia roll into Georgia, into the Ossetia region, under the pretext of trying to protect Russians. How much do you think we may be looking at a replay of that same playbook now happening in the Ukraine? Do you see parallels?
I think that's a very important precedent, and really I think what we see now is if the United States does absolutely nothing, or its equivalent, what it does give is a green light for Russia to do this in multiple other places where they have had historical influence, where there are ethnic Russians and there are serious divides with a majority ethnicity that's not Russian.
But the obvious follow-up then would be, what is it that the United States can do, should do? We've heard a lot of talk coming out of the administration, but in the past, red lines have been something to approach tentatively and then run back from. So what can they do that would have credibility, do you think?
Well, you're very correct. They have had a lot of empty talk, and red lines don't really do any good if they're immediately erased. I think the first thing we have to do as a country, under I think very difficult political conditions and with an absence of leadership, frankly, out of the White House, we have to be clear that we need to get off of invade or ignore false choices. I think that there are stakes to our interests, and frankly, the freedom of the Ukrainian people is not just a small matter to push aside if Russia seeks to use its influence to crush their freedom. So I think we need to find ways to at least speak truth about what Russia is and what it's doing. That's the least we can do. And then we should be working together with like-minded allies. I would think the Poles would have a lot of sympathy for what's going on in the Ukraine. I would think, as you mentioned, the Georgians and others, we should be engaging these like-minded communities to find ways, are there things we could do to help them pool resources to support the Ukrainians in what I think is legitimate self-determination.
Stephen, what do you believe Vladimir Putin's end game is in all of this?
I think Vladimir Putin is someone for whom the Cold War never ended. We in America are very fond of sort of declaring and undeclaring things and just assuming the rest of the world will follow. But just like terrorists haven't undeclared a war on us, I don't think that for Putin the Cold War ever really ended. And I think restoration of a sense of empire, a return to that power and nationalism and sense of dignity in his mind is what they seek. And so reimposing this sphere of influence, I think, is very important to him strategically.
So then, Mr. Yates, we've seen these sort of paratrooper-looking individuals who have taken over these two airports in the Crimea. What do we know about them? The Russians are saying that they have not, in fact, invaded, that they do not have their forces in there. But it's pretty obvious when you look at them. They have these assault weapons, very advanced. They're all in fatigues. They're wearing the balaclavas. These are some pretty serious military people. Obviously, where else would they come from?
Right. I think there's a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. First and foremost, it wouldn't be shocking to find that the Russians might not be telling the truth. But second, it also is very likely the case that they have trained and collaborated with a lot of people in the Ukraine, in the Crimea area, and that there could be people who are native of the Ukraine who are armed, equipped, trained, and basically look and behave as Russian paratroopers. So I think that's one of those areas where fog may actually affect what we can tell, but this is one of those cases where we shouldn't assume the truth and maybe look at the images of how things have broken out so far in the Ukraine and probably assume this isn't a prelude to an invasion. The invasion has already begun, in my view.
All right, so let's a couple of takeaways that you're giving us, Stephen. Number one, you believe it is an invasion. Number two, this invasion, part of a civil war within the Ukraine. We take a look at Crimea, the other ethnic Russians. But the flip side of it is what you said about the American response. You characterized a dichotomy between invade or ignore. 30 seconds. What are the other degrees of response the United States should keep in mind?
Well, first is to speak moral truth. Second would be to offer some resources directly to the Ukrainians who seek legitimate self-determination. I think in the middle range of there would be to work with like-minded allies. Europe has been in a postmodern dream for much of the last decade. Time for them to step up, and the things that we ought to do to work with like-minded Europeans to support the
Very
Ukrainians.
good,
Very
Stephen
important.
Yates. Very good. We appreciate your insights on this topic and want to thank you very much.